And let's take a look at some international news. The International Criminal Court judges have issued an arrest warrant for Russia's President Vladimir Putin. This for alleged war crimes in Ukraine. The Hague-based court claims that Putin is responsible for unlawful deportation of children and their unlawful transfer from occupied areas of Ukraine to the Russian Federation. A second person, Maria Alekseyevna Lvova-Belova, the Commissioner for Children's Rights in the office of the President of Russia's Federation, is also charged with the same crimes.
The ICC says the pre-trial chamber has found that there are reasonable grounds to believe that both President Putin and Ms. Lvova-Belova bear responsibility for the war crime of unlawful deportation of children and that of their unlawful transfer from occupied areas of Ukraine to Russia.
The International Criminal Court has issued 2 warrants of arrest in the Ukraine situation. For Vladimir Putin, President of the Russian Federation, and for Maria Lvova-Belova, Commissioner of the Russian President for Children's Rights, for the alleged war crimes of deportation of children from Ukrainian occupied territories into the Russian Federation.
The ICC says there are reasonable grounds to believe that both accused bear individual criminal responsibility for the aforementioned crimes and for having committed the acts directly or jointly with others and for failure to exercise control over civilian and military subordinates who committed or allowed these acts.
This is an important moment in the process of justice before the ICC. The judges have reviewed the information and evidence submitted by the prosecutor and determined that there are credible allegations against these persons for the alleged crimes. The ICC is doing its part of work. As a court of law, the judges issued arrest warrants. Their execution depends on international cooperation.
Russia is not a signatory to the Rome Statute and does not recognize the court's jurisdiction. Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova said on social media that the arrest warrants have no meaning for Russia, including from a legal point of view. Sherwin, Bryce-Pease, SABC News, New York.
Well, SABC's news correspondent in New York is Sherwin Bryce-Pease, and he's been keeping an ear to the ground on this story, and he joins us now for a little bit more on that. Sherwin, let's start at the beginning. The legal issue has been raised. Russia, Ukraine are not members of the statute of the ICC. So how on earth does this chamber issue this order if Russia and Ukraine are not party states?
Because Ukraine, Peter, invited ICC jurisdiction over crimes committed in its territory as far back as 2013. So even when Russia's so-called special military operation, which we all now know is a full-scale war, began in February last year, the ICC already had jurisdiction over crimes committed in that territory. And what you've seen from Karim Khan, the ICC prosecutor, since March of last year, when he launched the current investigation into atrocity crimes in Ukraine, he has since visited 4 times and is investigating and systemically putting together a case that is over time, Peter, expected to be broadened, right? The focus here in terms of the pre-trial chamber's arrest warrants that have been issued to the 2, Vladimir Putin and Alekseyevna Lvova-Belova, the Commissioner for Children's Rights in the Office of the President, relates to the illegal deportation of children from Ukraine into Russian territory. It is allegedly responsible for the war crime of unlawful deportation of children and that of unlawful transfer of children from occupied territories of Ukraine to the Russian Federation. They believe this is the pre-trial chamber. Essentially, this is a decision handed down by judges at the ICC, that there are reasonable grounds to believe that Mr. Putin bears individual criminal responsibility for the aforementioned crimes, for having committed the acts directly, jointly with others, and for his failure to exercise control properly over civilian and military subordinates who committed the act. So this also then applies to Ms. Lvova-Belova, the Commissioner for Children's Rights in the Office of the President. Karim Khan in February of this year really spoke, Peter, to the international role that the ICC plays here in terms of international jurisprudence. This is what he had to say. Watch.
From Kyiv to Cox's Bazar, from Kharkiv to Khartoum, international justice is on their side. And if we do that, perhaps we can move more positively in a better direction to make finally, once and for all, in the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we deliver on the promise of never again and the prayer of a world with more justice and less crime. I said very clearly in Bucha that unfortunately and objectively, Ukraine was a crime scene. And the accounts that we have seen fortify the conclusion that manifestly, ever more vividly, we are certain that there are reasonable grounds to that Rome Statute crimes appear to have been committed in Ukraine.
And so in many ways, Peter, this is just the beginning. This is just the beginning of indictments that will be handed down by the ICC, one suspects. This is an ongoing investigation. They are also investigating various atrocity crimes as it relates to indiscriminate bombing. You will have seen yesterday the UN Commission of Inquiry, an independent human rights commission of inquiry established by the Human Rights Council in Geneva last year, issued its first report. And among the findings, Peter, was that Russian forces carried out indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks on Ukraine, including torture and killings that could amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. They talk and list the indiscriminate attacks against hospitals, infrastructure, schools, shops, places where there has been a large concentration of people. We have seen the images of apartment buildings in Ukraine being targeted. We have seen the indiscriminate nature of missiles being fired at the electricity infrastructure, which has implications for the civilians in Ukraine, and various other iterations of aggression by the Russian Federation. That Commission of Inquiry also found that there were certain acts by Ukrainian forces that could amount to war crimes. So Ukraine certainly not completely exonerated, but certainly the report focused on a disproportionate and indiscriminate attacks by Russian forces that could amount to war crimes. So one therefore expects, Peter, that Karim Khan will be moving on further indictments in the weeks, months, and certainly years ahead.
So what's been their reactions initially to the current indictments from the Ukrainians? And the Russians, I guess, they've probably just dismissed this out of hand.
Let me start quickly with what the spokesperson for the Secretary General, Stefan Dujarric, said earlier today. He was asked, what the reaction was, and he said that the ICC is independent of the UN Secretariat. We do not comment on their actions. He was then asked if the Secretary General would continue to engage with Vladimir Putin. He is, of course, the head of state of the Russian Federation. And Stefan said, we will continue to speak to anyone in order to deal with the issues at hand. We've also heard from President Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine. He called the issuance of these warrants. The warrant is a historic decision that will lead to historic accountability. The prosecutor general in Ukraine, a gentleman by the name of Andrei Kostin, said now if Putin leaves Russia, he would be arrested and surrendered to the ICC. World leaders will think twice before shaking hands or sitting with Putin at the negotiating table. It is another clear sign to the world that the Russian regime is critical. And just think now of the implications, right? He talks about, world leaders thinking twice about sitting around a negotiating table. Vladimir Putin, and in his role as president of the Russian Federation, is a member of the G20, a member of BRICS. The question is, will he still be welcomed at these various forums where Russia has a seat? That he, as the head of state, often, not always, occupies. Will he be sending Sergei Lavrov in his wake to, for example, the BRICS summit that will be hosted by South Africa later this year? Let's listen to what the Kremlin spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, had to say in response to these warrants. Of course, they have already said that the ICC does not have jurisdiction over Russia. This is what he had to say.
We consider the very formulation of the question outrageous and unacceptable. Russia like a number of states, does not recognize the jurisdiction of this court, and, accordingly, any decisions of this kind are null and void for the Russian Federation from the legal point of view.
So, lots still to come in this, we imagine, Peter, in the weeks and months ahead. Russia might not be a signatory to the Rome Statute, but Vladimir Putin today is certainly a wanted man, and certainly will be thinking twice in terms of where he travels to, given the fact that 2/3 of the international community, about 123 states, are parties to the Rome Statute, and it is incumbent on them, based on that Rome Statute, to arrest an indicted person, a wanted person of the ICC, were they to set foot in the territory of a signatory to the Rome Statute, Peter.
And we have our own lessons, don't we, here in South Africa, when Omar Bashir travelled here. And as a state party, we were brought to task over this issue. And I guess this could be the consequence for the other 123 countries if they don't arrest Bashir if he lands in their country.
Well, you'll remember that Omar al-Bashir went to South Africa in 2015 to attend an AU summit, a heads of state summit. And of course, the court requested ahead of his arrival in South Africa the arrest and for him to be transferred to The Hague. Of course, South Africa didn't comply. Omar al-Bashir famously departed the country before an arrest could be executed. Of course, this was a matter ventilated first in the South African High Court, went as far as the Supreme Court of Appeals in Bloemfontein, which handed down a judgment in which they criticized the South African government for its disgraceful conduct for allowing Bashir to depart the country. So we know what our national courts say, because the Rome Statute has been incorporated into the national legislative judicial framework that is South Africa. Further to that, Peter, and a lot of people will forget this, that the ICC court itself ruled on South Africa's actions in a decision in 2017 that South Africa failed to comply with its obligations under the Rome Statute by not executing the court's request to arrest Bashir and surrender him to the court. They referred the matter to the states parties. There was criticism that the ICC didn't refer South Africa's inaction to the UN Security Council, because it was the UN Security Council that referred the situation in Darfur, for which Omar al-Bashir was indicted for actions in Darfur. It was the UN Security Council that referred that matter to the ICC. So in a sense, there were questions raised about whether the ICC would then refer South Africa back to the Security Council, which did not happen. And of course, South Africa has received no real sanction for its inaction. But the courts have ruled, and so it would be very, very interesting, tricky for South Africa to invite President Putin to a BRICS summit in South Africa and not arrest him, given that there is now judicial precedent on this matter.
All right, we talked about reactions. I would imagine it's a difficult one for the US. Whilst they might be pleased with developments, they're not a state party, and they've got a record of not cooperating with the ICC in the past as well. So it's a difficult one for them. They just watch quietly in the White House, I'm guessing.
Yeah, there hasn't been much reaction from President Biden or the White House, given this very, difficult thread, a needle to thread in a sense, because the United States isn't a states party, China is not a states party, Russia is not a states party, India is not a states party. But your question was, this is tricky for non-states parties. I assure you, Peter, it's tricky for states parties. I mean, just consider the day South Africa has the option to arrest Vladimir Putin on its territory, given that that's the legal obligation here. I mean, that's going to be a tricky boat for South Africa to sail in many ways. So one imagines that there's some note verbals being exchanged which is official diplomatic communication between countries, between Pretoria and Moscow. Maybe a little too soon for that, because I'm sure the travel arrangements for that BRICS summit haven't been finalized, but messages will certainly be going out to the president of Russia not to travel to certain countries, because of the difficulties those countries then will face, given South Africa's very close bonds with the Russian Federation, dating back to its struggle days, the African National Congress, very close relations with the USSR. So a very, very difficult road for South Africa to tread, were someone like Vladimir Putin to arrive on its doorstep.
You talk about other indictments and other investigations. I mean, the general public were probably thinking of much worse, not trying to belittle the legal movement of children, but from what we were seeing and the reports that were coming out right from the get-go of the war, why do you think, or has it been explained why they've gone with this indictment initially? Is it low-hanging fruit, testing the waters?
I think you hit the nail on the head there, Peter. I think it is low-hanging fruit. It's probably a much easier case to prove. But I think it also demonstrates the ICC's posture here, that they are aggressively pursuing this case in its fulsome breadth. Starting, as you say, with the low-hanging fruit, because I think, there's testimonies from mothers and parents that have lost children, and the kids themselves, many of them orphans that were moved from Ukrainian territory to the Russian Federation. There's a great deal of concern that these kids are being harmed mentally, psychologically, being separated from family. So the urgency, certainly one can understand in terms of getting these kids home. But as you say, we don't know the details or the thinking behind why this would be the first case, right? I mean, there have been well-documented strikes on shopping malls in Ukraine, well-documented strikes on apartment buildings. We've seen attacks on train stations, areas that are populated by civilians, which runs counter to international law. The targeting of civilians is a crime against humanity. So it's difficult for me to speculate, Peter. We don't know the reasoning behind this, but it's certainly just the beginning. One expects Karim Khan to open further investigations, and one expects further indictments to be handed down by the pre-trial chamber, as we saw in the case of the children being transported to Russia.
All right, and a final quick question. China's busy trying to negotiate something between Ukraine and Russia, and are there fears that this kind of action, this indictment, whilst it's legal, may have political consequences in terms of Russia's reaction?
Yeah, China, though, will sort of affirm Russia's position that basically the jurisdiction of the ICC as it pertains to Russia is null and void, because China, too, is not a signatory to the Rome Statute. And you'll have seen that President Xi Jinping is expected to travel to Moscow next year. You'll remember they've also recently released a 10-point plan, what they call a peace document. The EU has said it's not really a peace document. It's kind of just a statement from the Chinese of what they would like to see. So they really have a big role to play here in terms of peacemaker. The question is that close relationship between Moscow and Beijing going to frame the debate moving forward, right? Is he going to reach out? Is Xi Jinping going to reach out to Volodymyr Zelensky? Is he going to be even keeled in terms of his relationship with both countries? And that still remains to be seen. He is, of course, making a very high-profile trip to Moscow next week. And, of course, this comes now after Vladimir Putin is indicted. And one wonders how that decision by the ICC is going to shape those engagements next week. One imagines not so much.
All right, Sherwin, always great catching up with you. Thanks so much indeed for your time as always. All right, that's our New York correspondent, Sherwin Bryce-Pease, giving us the update on Vladimir Putin's warrant of arrest by the ICC. The ICC president, Hofmansky, said that we're a court of law. We're not interested in the politics of these issues, Russia and Ukraine. We just look at the legal aspects, and that's what they're doing.